Welcome to the Deep Dive. It's April 2025, and, well, the sheer number of conflicts going on around the world might actually surprise you.
Hmm.
We're looking at 59 ongoing conflicts right now. That's the highest number since 1946.
Wow. 59.
Yeah. And while some conflicts, rightly get a lot of news coverage, many others, which are just as devastating, are happening largely outside the main focus of Western media.
It's a really stark contrast, isn't it? All these conflicts kind of simmering almost in the shadows of the ones we hear about constantly.
Exactly.
So today we're focusing on what we could call these lesser-known civil wars. And there are really two key things that define them for our chat today.
Okay.
First, there's the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. They're a major research group, and they use a pretty grim but necessary benchmark, at least 1,000 battle-related deaths in a year. That's what officially classifies something as a civil war for them.
1,000 deaths.
And second, for us, a lesser-known conflict is one that hits that tragic number, causes huge human suffering, but still doesn't really grab consistent headlines in, say, mainstream Western news.
Got it. And that's really the heart of our mission for this deep dive.
Sure.
We want to shine a light on 5 of these conflicts, try to understand, what's driving them, and really get a sense of the scale of the impact.
So where are we focusing?
We'll be looking at the Sahel region, specifically Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It's a whole region grappling with this escalating jihadist insurgency.
Okay.
Then we'll shift to Myanmar, especially what's happened since the military coup back in February 2021.
A very volatile situation there.
Definitely. After that, South Sudan looking at the violence even after the 2018 peace deal.
A fragile piece, it seems.
Very. Our fourth area is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, focusing on those really persistent, brutal conflicts in the eastern part of the country.
Right, the Kivas especially.
And finally, Yemen, that devastating ongoing conflict between the Houthi rebels and the government.
And if you just, step back and look at the total impact of just those 5 situations, the numbers are frankly staggering.
Yeah.
We're talking hundreds of thousands killed, millions upon millions forced from their homes. These aren't small skirmishes. They are major, deadly wars by any standard.
And yet, like we said, they often just don't get that sustained geopolitical spotlight that other crises command.
It's a strange dynamic.
So let's start with the Sahel,
Uh-huh.
Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, this jihadist insurgency crisis.
Mhm.
It seems to have really spiraled since about 2012.
Yeah, and what's really crucial to grasp about the Sahel is that these aren't just separate problems in each country. It's interconnected.
How so?
Well, a lot of analysts trace the initial destabilization back to the civil war in Libya in 2011.
Ah, the fallout from that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Weapons flooded the region, experienced fighters moved around, and then this fed into a Tuareg rebellion in northern Mali in 2012. That rebellion was pretty quickly hijacked by jihadist groups. That led to a coup in Mali, and then the violence just sort of cascaded across the borders into Burkina Faso and Niger. Porous borders make it easy.
And the nature of the violence itself seems to be changing. I saw something from ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, about a big jump in remote violence.
That's right, a doubling since 2022.
So that's things like drones, IEDs.
Precisely. Improvised explosive devices, drone strikes, and these tactics, they often have just a devastating impact on ordinary civilians.
I can imagine.
And when you look at the specifics, Burkina Faso, you mentioned it earlier, 500,000 people displaced just since 2021.
500,000.
And 6.3 million needing aid this year. In Niger, it's 4.5 million needing help.
Just huge numbers.
And it's not just fighting between governments and the jihadist groups like JNI, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, or IS Sahel, the Islamic State branch.
Right.
There are also these really worrying reports, accusations of state-backed militias in Burkina Faso targeting Fulani communities, massacring them because they're suspected of supporting insurgents.
Oh, wow. That just pours fuel on the fire, doesn't it? Ethnic tensions.
It absolutely does. It just worsens existing divisions and creates these vicious cycles of violence.
It paints a really bleak picture. A whole region just under immense pressure.
And the overall toll,
Mhm.
casualties, the humanitarian side, it's enormous. The Sahel accounts for a huge chunk of the, 330,000 battle deaths across Africa in just the last 3 years.
300,000.
Yeah. And in 2023 alone, ACLED tracked over 10,000 violent events just across those 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger.
10,000 incidents.
And tragically, civilian deaths are clearly rising. That increase in IEDs, drones, It makes it so hard to distinguish fighters from non-fighters. The sheer number needing help across the Sahel, 33 million people, it's almost hard to comprehend.
33 million.
And think about the kids, 5 million out of school.
5 million.
1.5 million facing acute malnutrition. We're potentially losing a whole generation.
No, that's horrifying. Specific examples.
Well, in Mali, over 1,000 schools are closed because it's just too dangerous.
1,000 schools.
And in Niger, maybe 700,000 children are literally at risk of starvation.
It's almost impossible to grasp that level of suffering. So why? Why does a crisis this huge stay so kind of hidden from the main news cycle?
It's a really important question, that dynamic of media coverage. There are a few things feeding into it, I think.
Okay.
First, it's just really complex. You've got multiple countries, loads of different jihadist factions, JNIM, IS Sahel, various ethnic militias, plus the history of outside involvement, like France's military operations in the past.
Right, Operation Barkhane and all that.
Exactly. It's a messy story to tell quickly and simply, which news outlets often prefer.
Makes sense.
Second, from a purely maybe cynical Western geopolitical view, the Sahel doesn't have the same kind of direct strategic or economic pull that guarantees intense ongoing media focus like some other places do.
Less perceived interest.
Unfortunately, yes. And finally, media outlets often go for stories that are maybe more visually dramatic or, frankly, easier and safer for their teams to access and report on.
And you see that online, too. Less buzz on social media.
Yeah, definitely. Posts about the Sahel conflicts tend to be less frequent, and they just don't get the same viral traction as, say, Ukraine or other big global stories.
So is anything actually being done? Are there efforts to tackle this crisis?
There are efforts, yes, both regional and international, but they face huge hurdles.
Like what?
Well, the G5 Sahel joint force that military coalitions set up to fight the insurgents, it's been seriously weakened by all the political instability, especially the coups in Mali and Burkina Faso.
Right, the coups really complicated things.
Hugely. And the UN mission in Mali, MINUSMA, which did provide some stability, well, it ended its mission last year, that leaves a potential security gap.
What about aid?
Humanitarian groups like Concern Worldwide, they're doing vital work, reaching millions, but the funding, it's just not keeping up.
How bad is the shortfall?
So far this year, only about 40% of what the UN appealed for the whole Sahel region has actually come through.
Only 40%. That's sobering. Okay, let's shift gears. Our second conflict zone, Myanmar. It has a long history of internal conflict, but that coup in February 2021 really poured gasoline on the fire, didn't it?
It absolutely did. What's so worrying about Myanmar is how quickly it reversed that fragile move towards democracy.
Yeah?
The coup ousted Aung San Suu Kyi's elected government. People protested massively, and the military, the Tatmadaw, responded with just brutal force.
Right.
And that crackdown led directly to the rise of all these resistance groups. You've got the National Unity Government, the NUG, which is like the civilian government in exile.
Okay.
Plus the established ethnic armed organizations who've been fighting for decades anyway.
Right, the AOs.
And then these local people's defense forces, the PDFs, springing up everywhere basically in response to the coup.
So it's incredibly fragmented.
Extremely. Tragically, by 2024, Myanmar actually has the highest number of non-state armed groups active within its borders anywhere in the world.
Wow. Highest globally.
Right.
And this isn't just fighting in remote jungles, right?
Yeah.
It affects everyone.
No, it's hitting urban areas, rural areas, and the military strategy, the four-cut strategy you mentioned.
Yeah, that sounded particularly nasty.
It is. The aim is to cut off all support to resistance groups, food, money, intel, recruits, but it often means directly targeting civilians. Horrific stuff, like that massacre in eastern Myanmar back in December 2021.
God, and the death toll.
ACLED estimated over 13,600 deaths just in 2022. That gives you a sense of the intensity, and sadly, that level of violence hasn't really let up into 2025.
The human cost must just be astronomical.
It's devastating. Since the coup, reports suggest over 860 people killed, thousands detained by the military. The number of internally displaced people forced from their homes within Myanmar, is now 2.8 million this year.
2.8 million.
And a staggering 18.6 million people need urgent humanitarian help.
Almost 19 million people.
Yeah. The military's tactics have caused widespread food shortages, nearly 13 million facing hunger.
13 million.
And the Rohingya in Rakhine State, their situation is still terrible. Another 300,000 displaced recently because of fighting involving the Iraqi army, one of the ethnic
It
groups.
just keeps getting worse for them.
And the economy's taken a massive hit, too. GDP shrank by almost 20% in 2021. Plus, again, the impact on kids, maybe 1.5 million out of school.
1.5 million kids. Given all these horrifying numbers, why don't we hear more about Myanmar consistently? It feels like it dropped off the radar after the initial coup coverage.
It really does underscore how selective global media attention can be, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The coup itself got a lot of coverage, sure, but then the focus shifted. The war in Ukraine obviously has huge geopolitical weight and dominates headlines.
Understandably, but still.
Right. And Myanmar's conflict is complex. All those different ethnic groups, long histories. It's a tough narrative for Western outlets to follow consistently and explain easily.
Plus, the junta controls information flow.
Exactly. They impose internet blackouts, arrest journalists. That makes independent reporting incredibly difficult and dangerous.
And less social media buzz, too.
Yeah, public engagement online just seems lower compared to other major global crises.
So, are there any real international efforts making headway trying to fix this?
Making headway might be too strong a word, unfortunately. International efforts have been pretty limited in their impact.
How so?
Well, the UN has called for sanctions and arms embargo, but key players like China and Russia keep supplying the junta with weapons. That really undermines any pressure.
So the embargoes aren't really working.
Not effectively. And ASEAN, the Southeast Asian group, they came up with this 5-point consensus plan.
Right, I remember that. Stop the violence, start dialogue.
Yeah, but the military leaders have basically just ignored it.
What about aid groups?
Organizations like the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, they're doing amazing work, reaching over 1 million people this year, but their access is severely limited by the fighting and the junta blocking them.
So they can't get everywhere they need to.
No. We do see inspiring stuff at the grassroots level, like those local PDFs defending their communities, but they're massively outgunned by the military. It's a very tough fight.
Okay, let's move south now to South Sudan. Independence since 2011, so much hope then, but just plagued by conflict since 2013. Even a peace deal in 2018 hasn't stopped the violence flaring up again.
It's a deeply, deeply disheartening story. That initial promise of independence just hasn't materialized.
Yeah.
The conflict that broke out in 2013, mostly between forces loyal to President Kiir, who's Dinka, and those backing his then VP Riek Machar, who's Nuer, it quickly became brutally ethnic.
Right, the Dinka-Nuer dimension was key.
Absolutely. That first phase of the war was horrific. Over 400,000 deaths, maybe 4.5 million people displaced by 2018.
400,000 killed.
Yeah. And while the 2018 peace deal did reduce the large-scale fighting for a while, the root causes the power struggles, the mistrust, they were never really fixed.
So the peace was built on shaky ground.
Very shaky. And now we're seeing a worrying return of armed clashes in several states in 2024. Plus, the very recent news, President Kiir putting Riek Machar under house arrest in March.
House arrest, wow.
Yeah, that seriously damaged the fragile peace process and seems to have triggered fresh fighting in some areas.
And I read about groups like the White Army being involved. That sounds ominous.
It is. The White Army is a Nuer militia, historically known for pretty brutal tactics. Their involvement raises fears of escalating ethnic violence again.
And weapons flowing in from Sudan next door, with Sudan itself in chaos.
Exactly. That border is long, hard to control. It makes stopping illegal arms flow almost impossible, which just fuels the fighting in South Sudan.
A perfect storm, almost.
And the UN has actually warned about this, the potential for a wider regional war, given the chaos in Sudan and how linked these border areas are.
What's the current human toll? Casualties, displacement.
Well, the direct conflict deaths aren't quite at the catastrophic levels of the earlier war phase, thankfully, but hundreds have still tragically died in this renewed violence in 2024.
Hundreds still dying.
Yes. And sadly, about 2 million people are still displaced from their homes.
2 million still can't go home.
Right. Food insecurity is incredibly high, over 7 million people facing acute hunger right now.
7 million.
And again, the impact on children is devastating. Maybe 1.4 million out of school, around 870,000 suffering severe malnutrition.
And sexual violence. Still a major issue.
Tragically, yes. It remains a pervasive, horrific feature of the conflict used against women and girls.
It's just heartbreaking how persistent this suffering is. Why doesn't South Sudan get more consistent international attention?
Again, it's a mix of factors. One is being overshadowed by newer, maybe faster-moving crises, especially the war next door in Sudan since 2023. That's drawn a lot of immediate media focus.
The newer crisis's effect.
Kind of. Also, despite the UN peacekeeping mission, UNMISS, being there, There's a feeling perhaps that there hasn't been enough decisive international action to really force a political solution or hold perpetrators accountable.
Hmm.
Media access is tough too. Getting into affected areas is difficult, often dangerous for reporters.
Restricts the stories getting out.
Exactly. And sadly, there's just this tendency for Western public attention to drift away from long, drawn-out conflicts if they don't seem to directly involve major global powers or immediate strategic interests. Social media chatter about South Sudan is also relatively low.
So what efforts are happening on the ground?
Well, the UN mission, UNMIS, still has a big presence. They protect hundreds of thousands of civilians in special protection sites.
POC sites, right?
Yeah. The African Union and IGAD, the regional body, they've been trying to mediate, but Makar's house arrest has really stalled things recently.
Right, hard to mediate with one side under house arrest.
Precisely. Aid groups like the World Food Program are crucial, feeding millions, but they constantly face challenges, especially funding gaps.
Always the funding.
Always. And there are local peace efforts too, NGOs working at the community level on reconciliation, but it's an uphill battle without strong political will from the top.
Okay, fourth region. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC. The big national wars ended years ago, but the East, it's still incredibly violent, right?
Incredibly so. What's really striking in the DRC is just the sheer number of armed groups, especially in the East, North, and South Kivu. We're talking over 120 different groups active there.
Over 120? How is that even possible?
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. So the big wars of the late 90s, early 2000s, they officially ended. But these localized yet incredibly vicious conflicts just haven't stopped. In some places, they've actually gotten worse.
And the M23 group is prominent again.
Very prominent. They've reportedly got backing from Rwanda, though Rwanda denies it. And they've really consolidated control over territory this year. Captured key towns, threatening major cities.
But they're just one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly, just one piece. You've also got groups like the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, who've pledged allegiance to ISIS.
Right.
And then countless local militias known as Mai Mai. Some are self-defense groups, some are purely predatory, some even align with the Congolese army sometimes. It's incredibly fragmented and shifting.
And the roots go way back. I remember reading links to the Rwandan genocide in '94.
That's a huge factor, a very long shadow. The influx of Hutu militias and Rwandan refugees into eastern DRC after the genocide completely destabilized the region. It really laid the tracks for all the conflict that followed.
So what fuels it now? Still those old tensions?
Partly, yes. But it's also a toxic mix of fierce competition over the region's incredible mineral wealth, gold, cobalt, coltan.
Conflict minerals.
Exactly. Plus deep-seated ethnic rivalries and political power plays. And that alleged Rwandan support for M23, which UN reports seem to confirm, despite Kigali's denials, is a massive ongoing source of tension and violence.
That Second Congo War was called Africa's World War, wasn't it?
It was. Because so many neighboring countries got involved, the scale was immense.
And the humanitarian fallout today from these ongoing Eastern conflicts, still massive.
Absolutely staggering. The Second Congo War might have caused around 3 million deaths, mostly civilians from disease and starvation linked to the conflict.
3 million.
Yeah. But the current violence, these localized conflicts, they're still incredibly deadly. ACLE data suggests the violence levels in eastern DRC often exceed those in many conventional wars.
Really? Higher than some wars we hear more about?
Often, yes, in terms of incidence and impact on civilians. This year, the UN says over 25 million Congolese need humanitarian aid.
25 million.
And the number of internally displaced people, over 6 million, is the highest for internal displacement in any single country globally.
Highest in the world.
Yes. Sexual violence is rampant, horrific, especially in North Kivu, and armed groups just plunder the resources, which fuels the fighting and keeps local people desperately poor.
Given that scale, the suffering, the minerals, which the world needs, why does the DRC often feel like a forgotten crisis?
Well, again, that complexity is a huge barrier. Trying to explain 120-plus armed groups, the regional meddling, it's tough for news outlets and the public to follow.
It makes your head spin just thinking about it.
Exactly. And Western media often focuses on sudden, acute crises. There's that conflict fatigue factor with places like DRC where the violence has just ground on for decades.
So even though the numbers are huge, It's not new enough.
It can feel that way in terms of coverage.
Yeah.
The intense focus on, say, Gaza recently with its terrible but concentrated casualty figures can overshadow the DRC's ongoing tragedy, even if the long-term human cost there is arguably comparable or greater.
And direct Western interests. Maybe not perceived as high.
Despite the minerals, yeah. There isn't the same overt strategic calculation driving attention as in some other regions. And again, social media discussion tends to be more academic or NGO-driven, not broad public engagement.
What's being done to try and stabilize the eastern DRC?
Well, the big UN peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, has been there for years. But its effectiveness is often questioned by Congolese people themselves, and they're actually planning to withdraw a large number of troops by the end of this year.
Withdrawal. Won't that leave a gap?
That's the major concern, yes. A potential security vacuum. Regional efforts like deploying troops from the East African community haven't really stopped groups like M23 either.
So military solutions aren't working well.
Not effectively so far. Humanitarian groups like Doctors Without Borders, MSF, are doing critical work, treating hundreds of thousands, but they're constantly hampered by the danger, the insecurity.
And the minerals. Anything happening there?
There are ongoing efforts to push for responsible mineral sourcing, trying to cut off that funding stream for armed groups. But it's incredibly complex, trying to certify supply chains in such a chaotic environment.
A huge challenge. Okay, finally, let's turn to Yemen. Conflict since 2014 become one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters.
It really has. Yemen is fundamentally this incredibly complex proxy war. Primarily, it's the Yemeni government, backed by a Saudi-led military coalition fighting the Houthi rebels who get support from Iran and control a big chunk of the northwest, including the capital, Sana'a.
And the Saudi intervention in 2015 really ramped things up.
Dramatically. That's when it truly became this major regional power struggle playing out on Yemeni soil. And there was a truce in 2022, which helped for a bit.
Yeah, I remember that offered some hope.
It did. But the core issues weren't resolved, and we've still seen sporadic clashes, Houthi attacks, Saudi-led airstrikes continuing. The truce didn't fully hold or lead to lasting peace.
And it's not just those two main sides, is it? It's even more complicated.
Oh, much more complicated. You've got southern separatists backed by the UAE who want independence for the south.
Okay.
You've got extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, trying to exploit the chaos.
Right.
And various local tribes with their own shifting loyalties. It's a real tangled web.
And foreign powers just keep pouring fuel on the fire. Weapons, funding.
Absolutely. The massive flow of weapons, money, logistical support from external backers to all the different sides has undeniably made the conflict longer, deadlier, and much harder to resolve.
The humanitarian stats from Yemen are always just shocking. Consistently among the worst in the world.
They are utterly devastating, year after year. We think over 470,000 people have died, either directly from the fighting or indirectly from its consequences, like disease and starvation.
Nearly 500,000 people.
Yeah. This year, over 18 million Yemenis need humanitarian aid. That includes millions of young children whose lives are just hanging by a thread.
18 million.
It's consistently ranked as one of the world's worst crises for basic human needs, for hunger, for displacement. About 4.5 million people are internally displaced.
And starvation used as a weapon.
There have been credible reports of that, yes. Over 16 million people are facing acute food insecurity. The country's also been hit by repeated disease outbreaks, a big cholera epidemic just this year, affecting hundreds of thousands.
Cholera on top of everything else.
And most people, something like 80%, don't have access to clean water. It's a complete catastrophe.
Given this absolute catastrophe, why does Yemen sometimes feel overlooked compared to other Middle East crises?
Again, it's partly being overshadowed. The intense, sustained focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict recently has drawn a lot of the media oxygen away from Yemen.
Right.
Also, the sheer length of the war, it's in its 11th year now, probably contributes to that conflict fatigue we talked about.
People just switch off after so long.
It seems that way sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And the complexity, all the proxy angles, multiple actors, it makes it a harder story to follow than some others. Plus, access for journalists is really restricted, limiting that firsthand reporting.
So we don't get those on-the-ground stories as much.
Not as much as we should. We hear more recently about the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea because that impacts global trade.
Right, that gets headlines.
Exactly. But the devastating civil war itself, the suffering of ordinary Yemenis often remains in the background.
What efforts are being made then? To find peace or just help people survive?
The UN has been working hard on peace talks. That 2022 truce came out of their efforts. even though talks have stalled more recently.
So diplomacy is still happening, but slowly.
Yes, and humanitarian aid is absolutely vital. UNICEF is helping millions of kids with nutrition. The World Food Program feeds about 12 million people a month.
12 million a month. Just shows the scale of need.
It does. But again, the massive hurdle is funding. Only about half of what the UN asked for Yemen this year has actually been funded.
50% again, a recurring theme.
It is. And advocacy groups keep pushing for a proper arms embargo on everyone involved, but geopolitical interests make that really, really difficult to implement effectively.
Okay, so looking across all five, the Sahel, Myanmar, South Sudan, DRC, Yemen, what are the common threads? Why do these huge crises get overlooked? What are the bigger reasons?
Yeah, stepping back, you do see some broader patterns, some systemic biases in global media, and frankly, geopolitics.
Such as?
Well, first, there's definitely a tendency to prioritize conflicts that seem to directly impact Western strategic or economic interests.
Right.
The sheer amount of coverage for Ukraine, for example, compared to these others, it's a stark difference, driven partly by those perceived interests.
Even if the death tolls in some of these other conflicts are comparable or higher over time.
Exactly. Second, the complexity we keep mentioning. These conflicts often involve multiple non-state groups, deep ethnic roots, complicated proxy wars. They don't fit neat, simple narratives that news outlets sometimes favor.
Harder to explain in a soundbite.
Pretty much. Third, that conflict fatigue issue is real for long-running wars like Yemen or the DRC. They've been going on for so long they stop feeling like news.
Unless something dramatic and new happens, like the Red Sea attacks.
Precisely. Then there are the practical challenges. Reporting from these places is often dangerous. Access is restricted by governments or armed groups.
It makes it hard for journalists to do their jobs.
Absolutely. And we probably can't ignore potential racial or geographical biases in coverage, too. Crises in some parts of the world just seem to resonate less with Western audiences and media gatekeepers than others.
You see that reflected online, too.
Yeah, definitely. Look at social media mentions. Ukraine gets vastly more attention than, say, the Sahel or South Sudan, even when the humanitarian needs are immense in all cases.
The sheer human cost, when you add it all up across these 5 overlooked wars, it's just mind-blowing.
It really is. Hundreds of thousands killed in each conflict zone, millions upon millions displaced, tens of millions needing basic aid just to survive.
And putting those numbers next to more highly publicized conflicts really does force you to think, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Like you said, the comparison really highlights the disparity in attention. We mentioned Yemen's estimated 470,000 deaths. Compare that to the tragic, but in scale, different figure of around 39,787 reported deaths in the Israel-Palestine conflict since July 2023. The attention doesn't always match the scale of the long-term human toll.
But despite all the challenges, the lack of attention, the devastation, there are people working on the ground trying to make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. That's crucial to remember. There's hope in the efforts being made, even if they face huge obstacles.
Like what kind of efforts?
You've got everything from those multinational military efforts, like the G5 Sahel Force, however troubled, to the massive UN peacekeeping missions like UNSS in South Sudan and MONUSCO in DRC.
Right.
And then the absolutely vital work of humanitarian groups, UNICEF, IRC, WFP, MSF, Concern Worldwide, countless organizations working tirelessly, often in dangerous conditions, to provide aid and support.
And local efforts, too.
Yes, definitely. We talked about the community defense forces in Myanmar, the local peace-building groups in South Sudan, the advocacy for ethical mineral sourcing in the DRC. People on the ground are trying to build peace and resilience.
But they're hampered by
the things we've discussed. Chronic underfunding, lack of safe access, and often a lack of real political will from the main players to actually stop the fighting and build lasting peace.
So for us listening, feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed or helpless, what can we realistically do? How can we help raise awareness or make even a small difference?
That's the key question, isn't it? What's our role as global citizens? And there are actually tangible things.
Okay.
One is simply amplifying voices. Share information from reliable sources, from affected people, from organizations working there on social media. Use the hashtags, support UN campaigns like #ChildrenUnderAttack, help break through the noise.
Use our own networks.
Exactly. Second, if you can, support reputable humanitarian organizations financially. We mentioned Concern Worldwide reaching 15.5 million people, WFP feeding 12 million monthly in Yemen. That money translates directly into help on the ground.
Okay, direct support.
Third, advocacy. Contact your elected officials. Push for increased humanitarian funding, for smarter diplomacy, for effective arms embargoes where appropriate, like Human Rights Watch advocates for in Yemen. Let policymakers know you care about these crises too.
Use our political voice.
Yes. Fourth, educate yourself and others. Talk about these conflicts. Share what you learn. Host a discussion. Just bringing these hidden stories into the light is crucial.
Spreading awareness.
And fifth, where it applies,